Hi, welcome back. This video is going to walk you through some ideas from a paper a book chapter that I contributed in a book a few years ago. The book is titled Civility and Education in a World of Religious Pluralism. It was edited by Vincent Biondo and Andrew Fiala with Routledge University Press. Not Routledge University, but Routledge Press. The Routledge University that I know. All right, my paper was entitled in that volume, Religious Diversity, Truth, and Tolerance. So this version of the paper, though, is a slightly longer version than the one that appears there. So there's going to be more in this video than what's in the version in that chapter, slightly edited. This was an earlier draft that was a little too long to fit into that into the chapter for the book. So here it goes. Religious Diversity, Truth, and Tolerance. So in this chapter, this video presentation as well, I want to do four things. First, I want to look at the relationship between religious diversity and religious relativism. Second, I want to discuss the concept of tolerance as it applies to public support for and presumption of religious knowledge. I'm going to argue for the neutrality of public religious knowledge and for the presumption of the religious expression of religious knowledge. Thirdly, I consider the idea of tolerance as conceptually connected to the expression of religious knowledge and a rejection of religious relativism. So I argue that tolerance is a real virtue, which must be accepted if religious relativism is false. In addition, I want to make a distinction between practical and epistemic tolerance, arguing that only the former and not the latter should be accepted and promoted. Finally, I conclude with some reflections on the relationships between diversity, relativism, and tolerance as they relate to public education. So first, religious diversity and religious relativism. Religious diversity is an obvious fact of American social life. From this fact, several other truths can likely be inferred. Probably you've experienced this too if you've spent any time in the United States. Americans are more likely to experience and interact with people who believe different things about religion. Americans are likely to have their religious beliefs challenged by others who deny those beliefs. While the existence of religious diversity may motivate relativistic beliefs about religion, what doesn't logically follow from the fact of religious diversity is that the claim that there are no right answers to religious questions. For example, does God exist? Or what's the nature of the divine? Or is there an afterlife? Etc. Or that religious beliefs are true only relative to a religious community. I'm going to call that view religious relativism. More formally, religious relativism has two features, following Harvey Siegel's understanding of epistemic relativism. First, a religious relativist will maintain that, given any religious proposition P can only be established within a particular religious tradition. Second, a religious epistemic relativist will maintain that given two conflicting religious propositions P and Q, there's no neutral ground by means of which to adjudicate between those competing standards of evaluation. Questions here might be raised about this. 1. Are political people actually relativists about religion? 2. If so, why? I believe the answer to 1 is yes. There's some data to support for this. In a Barna poll in the Wall Street Journal article from some years ago, early 2000s, they reported that nearly 60% of evangelical Christian teenagers said that all religious faiths teach equally valid truths. And I think it's safe to say that even many religious people are relativists to one extent or another about religion. In other surveys, the researchers asked their self-identified Christian parents and their children if all different religions are equally good, ways of helping a person find ultimate truth. Results were that 40% of Catholic parents and 53% of Methodist parents agreed or strongly agreed with the claim, while 62% of Catholics and 57% of Methodist youth claimed to agree or strongly agree with that claim. This isn't conclusive evidence, but it resonates with my own experience of working with undergraduate students in philosophy and religion courses for many, many years now, a couple decades, almost 30 years. The second question, why are people relativistic in their thinking about religion, is a little bit less clear. It could be caused by the fact of religious diversity. Some evidence for this claim. Peter Mostert argues that undergraduate students become more relativistic due to exposure in introductory courses in psychology and sociology. They're eager to hear and easily convinced that cultural and social circumstances determine which values one prefers. Sociology and psychology offer them a plausible non-ethical declaration. Above that, such a non-ethical theory gives support to the conviction that everybody has his own preferred values, and that it does not make sense to criticize each other's values because everybody's situation is different. It just sounds like the things I've heard from students over the last 30 years or so. Additional research corroborates the idea that religious diversity might actually cause religious relativism. recent empirical study of students' beliefs regarding morality indicates that moral diversity seems to imply relativism in moral thinking. Quote, as individuals from an article by an author named Sarkisian, quote, as the individuals under discussion become more dissimilar, people become less and less inclined to agree with the claim that one of them has to be wrong. So when two individuals become dissimilar enough, people were far more willing to say that both of them can be right, end quote. The result of these empirical studies, the author concludes, quote, people's intuitions are influenced by the degree to which they actively consider alternate perspectives. The more people engage with radically different perspectives, the more they're drawn to moral relativism. If exposure to morally different perspectives entails moral relativism, and if moral and religious ideas are relatively similar, then exposure to religiously different perspectives could entail religious relativism. But at the extent of the causal role of religious diversity informing the relativistic religious beliefs, I will argue that the logical inference that there are no right answers to religious questions because of the fact of religious diversity is faulty. Here's a simplified version of this inference. So here's the argument for relativism, religious relativism. Is the premise of this argument true? Here's the argument. Premise. People differ in their religious beliefs. Conclusion, therefore, there are no religious truths independent of religious belief system. So, is the premise of this argument true? I mean, you could formalize this a little bit more if you want to. But, is this premise true? Do people differ in their religious beliefs? And I think the obvious answer is yes. Just ask someone that you know is between the ages of, 15 and 25. Some question about religion, say that whether the official Roman Catholic doctrine of hell is real. Just ask them that. And you'll probably get a wide range of conflicting opinions. We all know that people differ in their religious beliefs, so that premise is true. The real question that we have to ask is, does the conclusion follow from the premise? The answer is no. This is an argument as a non sequitur. This conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. Here's why. Consider another exact same argument with the exact same structure. I owe this inference to James Rachel's Critique of Relativism. It's a classic. You can go look it up if you like. Premise, people differ in their geographical beliefs, therefore there are no geographical truths. Now, that first premise, premise star, we'll call it, is also true. Just ask a group of people in a staff meeting or at work, or sitting around the dinner table, which way is north, and you have people pointing at which way. Right? So people can differ in their beliefs about geography, but it doesn't follow that there's no truth about geography simply from the fact that people differ about it. Since people differ in their beliefs about which way is north, does it follow that there's no truth about which way is north? And the answer is no. It does not. From the fact that different people have different opinions and beliefs, it doesn't follow that there's no right answers. So religious relativism, the idea that there are no right answers to religious questions, doesn't follow from the fact that people have different, even radically different beliefs about what those answers are. Now, someone could object to this argument, that the inference to religious relativism from religious diversity by criticizing a counterexample. The objection here is something like this. Look, of course it doesn't follow. There are no geographical truths. From the fact there's diversity of geographical belief, we can measure geography, compass, find the North Star, look at a map, pay somebody to tell you, whatever you want to do. But we can't measure religion, can't measure, like you can measure which way north, you can't measure religion. Okay. We can know things about the starry heaven, but not about the angelic one. We can measure the distance between the stars in heaven, but we can't measure the distance between angels in heaven dancing on the heads of pins. This type of objection misses the point. The point of the counterexample is not to show that there's a great disparity in the way we have scientific or religious knowledge. It's simply to show that belief diversity does not entail the absence of truth. Truth and belief are separate issues. It is logically possible that there are no religious truths, but this fact doesn't follow from religious diversity. In addition, this just begs the question about whether religious knowledge is even possible. It could be the case that knowledge is limited and measurable and empirical, but if this were so, then one, of course, could not be a relativist about knowledge in general, and thus one wouldn't be a relativist about religious knowledge on those grounds. One would simply reject the truth of all religious claims which are non-empirical, not for relativistic reasons. Without a good argument as to knowledge being limited to the empirical, this analogy between scientific and religious reasoning with respect to the fact of belief diversity not entailing the absence of truth seems plausible. An additional problem which plagues relativism about religious beliefs is the relativistic thinking in general is self-defeating. Asserting relativism about knowledge to be true is like affirming this proposition. Here's this proposition. P. There are no sentences longer than 5 words. Okay? There are no sentences longer than 5 words. The sentence is longer than 5 words. Okay? I think almost everyone who watches YouTube, if they're sober, can follow this. The sentence is longer than 5 words. thus it falsifies itself. But if religious relativism is self-refuting in this sort of way, is it? Well, is it self-affirming? Is it self-defeating to affirm Q? Here's proposition Q. All religious beliefs are established by epistemic standards of evaluation within a particular religious tradition. There's no neutral grounds by means of which to adjudicate between the competing standards of religious evaluation. So consider that proposition. Q appears self-refuting. Suppose religion 1, call it R1, affirm Q based on standard S1 internal to R1, and another religion, call it R2, affirm not Q on the basis of their standard S2. The advocate of Q, in this case, would have to admit that there's no neutral way to justify Q over not Q. Then Q itself cannot be established as reasonable. Even if it were argued that Q is established rationally outside of religion, if Q were denied within a religion, the no-neutrality conjunction of Q would still prohibit Q from being established. Indeed, if there were a conflict between attempting to establish Q or not Q, as long as one maintains the impossibility of no-neutrality, Q, in all instances, I would say, of epistemic relativism, will be self-refuting. Okay, so all forms of relativism are self-refuting. You just have to tweak the example slightly to show it. So there's a final difficulty of thinking about relativism in all its forms, and namely that's its unlivable. So these are three objections broadly to relativism. One, it doesn't follow from diversity of belief. Two, it's self-refuting. And three, it's unlivable. Okay, these are standard arguments that I teach, published on. So here's the third one. It's unlivable. If one were to be a relativist about moral beliefs, for example, one simply couldn't function with other human beings. In a sort of logical way pointed out by Hilary Putnam, the use of language itself requires shared meaning. Yet, if there are no right answers to philosophical questions, including questions about the meaning of words, then communication itself would be impossible. In fact, asserting a claim about relativistic belief would be impossible. It requires the hearer to understand and know what the person is asserting the claim is actually intended to mean. This is impossible if there are no right answers to questions about what words actually mean, including religious words. The impossibility of shared meaning of a relativist view of epistemology and metaphysics is philosophically complex and nuanced. But there are even more practical ways to illustrate the absurdity of relativistic thinking in everyday life. People might be relativistic when they're thinking about big questions like who's right or wrong, how do we live our lives, what is life all about, what's the correct way to worship God if he exists. These are all difficult philosophical questions. The answers to them are not easily forthcoming. The history of philosophy is full of various, often contradictory attempts to answer them. This reality may even contribute to relativistic thinking. But the big questions are difficult. When it comes to small questions, people can seem to drop quickly a relativistic posture about their beliefs. For example, someone might come into conversation complain about a religious group's overzealous or violent fervor in their beliefs about their holy book being desecrated, and yet at the same time complain about having their car broken into. That is, one can imagine a person who's a relativist about big questions, such as whether a particular book might be divine, and therefore ought to be respected. At the same time, this person believes that their own car ought to be respected. Again, a person might believe that when it comes to the question of whether one religion is right or wrong, there are no right answers because they're simply religious beliefs which are true for those religious communities. Yet, at the same time, the same person's car were broken into or stolen, there would be no question as to whether the car thief's culture's beliefs about stealing cars is simply relative to their tradition. Maybe it's a bizarre religious cult that has auto theft as one of its main devotional activities. I feel like there's certain parts of the world that religion is quite dominant. They seem to have exercised their religious activities in front of my house one time. They would unlikely conclude that there are no right answers as to whether the car should be stolen. People are often hesitant to judge the goodness or badness of a particular religious practice because they think that their religious beliefs are merely relative. When it comes to judging the goodness or badness of a particular moral practice, usually involving money, people become very objective. When it comes to money, people become very objective very quickly. They're claiming that there are right answers to philosophical questions. Consider a mundane, ordinary example. Suppose you go into Starbucks. This video is brought to us. Suppose Starbucks became a formalized religion. It's a bit like a cult, anyway. It's got its own language, liturgy, icons, rituals. Imagine that it's one of the main tenets of Starbuckianism to regularly keep customers change, right? So, in other words, Starbuckianism is a religion. It serves coffee, but it shortchanges every, 300th customer or something, or arbitrarily, Monday, certain times. Nobody knows when it's going to happen. Suppose you order a drink from this Starbucks, it's gone religious here, and you paid $5, if that's possible, today, with a $20 bill. For those of you who don't know, a $20 bill is a form of cash, paper money. People in the future watching this video aren't going to know what I'm talking about. So you pay with a $5 beverage and with a $20 bill. Suppose the barista only gives you $5 back in change. Says, thanks for coming to Starbucks. Can I help the next guest? You'd probably say, hey, I paid for with a 20 for a $5 drink. Where's my other $10 in change? And suppose the barista looks at you straight in the eye and says, excuse me, but who are you to judge me? Next, please. You wouldn't just say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was offending you. You can keep the change. No one would do that. You'd say something like, hey, you still owe me $10. Can I talk to the manager? Suppose the manager comes out, says, how can I help you? Explain how you paid for a $5 drink with a $20 bill and got $5 back and want your other $10. Suppose the manager then says, that's just true for your religion, but not true for ours. Would you back down thinking, oh yeah, I guess it's true for my religion, but not for the Starbuckians? Would you apologize for being closed-minded and judgmental? No. You'd say, what in the world? What are you talking about? Insert your favorite expletive there. What in the are you talking about? Suppose the manager then said, look, on our side of the counter, we have our own religious culture. And in our religion, we keep people's change. And we'd appreciate it if you didn't push your own religion's morality from that side of the counter onto us. Would you be okay with that? I think the answer is no. Because there's a right answer, independent of religion, which answers the questions whether or not we should give correct change. One final example will complete this video here. Imagine you had a boss who is a relativist. You make your sales quota for the month, and your sales exec says, that's just true for you that made your quota, but it's not true for me. This doesn't even make any sense. That's absurd. Because it's absurd, we should reject the absurd relativistic notion that there are no right answers to philosophical questions, including philosophical questions about religion. Okay, let me shift gears here and give you an example of how religious relativism shows up in actual cases. Okay, so here's a case of religious relativism showed up a few years ago in the late 90s, and things like this go on all the time, so you could probably find cases going on regularly. I wish it were isolated, but this occurred in the late 90s. A high school senior wanted to speak as a valedictory commencement address. He was a valedictorian, so he got to give the address. The student was prohibited from making a speech and sued the school, maybe the school district. The appeals court ruled in favor of the restriction, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to take the case. Whether or not the student's speech should be restricted is an open question. What I was struck by was the principal's reasoning in the justifying of restriction. The LA Times quoted the principal as saying, this is a quote from the article in 1999, to me, it's disrespectful when you ignore the diversity of your classmates and say you've got the only answer. I don't see God that way. So the principal's belief was something like this. All speech, call this belief B, all speech which makes exclusive claims and ignores diversity should be rejected. The problem is that B itself is exclusive and ignores diversity. The claim is self-refuting. Also note that part of the principal's justification is theologically exclusive and ignores diversity of theological exclusivists. This is an instance of the problematic self-defeating form of reasoning about religious diversity in public life, and it should be avoided. Okay, so if you want to have a healthy society where religion is part and parcel of public life, you have to reject religious relativism. The thing is just absurd. I've given you at least 3 reasons why. Thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. You!